Order, order. Minister to move the adjournment.
Beg to move that the sitting be now adjourned.
The question is that the sitting be now adjourned. Our first debate this morning is on Yemen. Keith Vaz.
Mr. Caton, it is a great pleasure to be able to serve under your chairmanship, I think, for the first time, and I'm most grateful to the Backbench Committee for granting this debate, and I am so pleased to see so many honourable and right honourable members here. The Minister, of course, who has frequently discussed with me on the floor of the House issues concerning Yemen, my honourable friend, the member for Harrow West, who's visited Yemen as International Development Minister in the last government, the Prime Minister's Special Envoy to Yemen, the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, Member for Gillingham and Rainham, Member for Hexham, the Member for Croydon Central, the Member for Elmet and Rothwell, and my honourable friend, honourable sister, the Member for Walsall South. Mr. Caton, the need for this debate is greater now than when I first proposed it to the Backbench Committee. Yemen is, as we speak in Westminster today, at a crisis point. At no time in the last several decades have I personally feared for the future of Yemen as I do today. In the last few weeks, President Hadi has escaped from house arrest and has fled to his stronghold in Aden. The Houthi rebels are yo-yoing between forming their own government and stuttered negotiations. The embassies of the United Kingdom, of the United States, of France, of Italy, of Germany, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have all been closed and evacuated. Supporters of various parties and tribal groups are protesting and clashing in the streets, and their supporters are being kidnapped and killed in these clashes. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula are grabbing power amidst the chaos. Many of those present here today share our concern about this beautiful country, but this is now a much wider crisis. Those concerned with security and stability in the Middle East should be paying very close attention to the situation in Yemen. I believe there is a consensus in this House that more needs to be done and that the British government needs to do much more. I'm proud to say that this is the first debate of any substance on Yemen and the Commons, and therefore an important one. Of course, I give way.
I very much congratulate him on securing this debate and enjoying the family outing that is this trip down Yemen Lane. But the serious point is this. Whilst it's true that he is right to ask the British government to do more, does he agree with me that it is also very much incumbent upon the Arab world, and particularly those wealthy and responsible Arab countries who are in control of their countries, to do more to regulate and keep the peace in Yemen?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and indeed I regard him as part of my wider family, Mr. Caton, because he is my next-door neighbour. So I'm very cautious of raising my voice too much in Normanshire North in case he hears me. He's absolutely right, and I will develop in my speech the argument that it's not just up to Britain. We have a very important part to play because we're very well respected. However, what is very important is that we get the support of countries around Yemen, especially Saudi Arabia, if we're going to make any progress. Yes, of course.
Right honourable gentleman in giving way, and I congratulate him on securing this debate. He's a passionate friend of Yemen. I think he's always considered me his family down in the south as well. The point he makes about the international assistance, does he agree with me that, when we talk about the Houthi rebels, we have to look at who is backing them? Iran is a key backer of the Houthis. And on that basis, when we talk about nuclear discussions with Iran, they should be linked to Iran giving up sponsoring and harbouring terrorism around the Middle East. Because without that, we may have a short-term fix, but a long-term problem for the world.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and yes, I do regard him as part of the even wider South Asian family from where I come from. And he is right. We have to look and see who is backing these rebels and what their cause is, and we have to deal with that. Can I just say, nobody doubts the government's commitment to providing support for Yemen. The Special Envoy, Member for Rutland and Melton, like my honourable friend, the Member for Harrow West, can proudly say that as a result of their tenure in their office, they actually saved the lives of many Yemenis. Very few of us in politics can say that. The ability to take a promise and deliver it. They were able to do so. And the role of the leader of the House, as the former Foreign Secretary, was critical at the time of the Arab Spring. So we know the British government has done a great deal in the past. That is why we look to the Minister, and I will tell him what I hope that the government will be able to do more, given the history that we have had. As the House knows, I have a strong personal interest in the long-term future of this country. I and my two sisters, one of whom is here today, were all born in Yemen, and my mother and sisters left there exactly 40 years ago in 1965, at a time when the situation was getting extremely hostile. I can remember the bombs exploding as we were making our way to the airport. So at that time, it was a time of crisis because it was a time of civil war. It is a country, Mr. Caton, that it is easy to fall in love with. People were extremely kind to us. We were a Catholic family from India, from Goa, who'd come to live in Yemen, but we were treated so well, as were all the migrant communities who'd come to live in the then South Yemen in Aden. And that is why I feel so strongly that we need to do more. The UK-born hostage, Luke Summers, who was tragically killed by Al-Qaeda while serving as an aid worker, was described by his family as loving the people and the culture of Yemen. I have returned repeatedly to the country as chair of the all-party group. When I was last in Yemen, the situation was extremely dangerous, so dangerous, in fact, that we were advised to stay in the hotel. We were required to stay in a fortified pod. Indeed, I stayed in the bed of the British ambassador. He was not there at the time, Mr. Caton. But they locked me up in this pod because they feared that we would come to danger. And I would think that the situation is much, much worse than it is at the moment. I can remember my visit with the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham on an all-party group delegation. He is a great photographer, Mr. Caton, and he went out to Sana'a, into the old city, which is a World Heritage City. We were very worried. We thought he'd been kidnapped, but actually he'd gone to the market in order to take photographs of the country and that city. So safe did he feel at that time. I'm afraid he wouldn't be able to do that today, given the current crisis that is happening there at the moment. There are three linked threats faced by this strategically vital country: political instability, a security vacuum, and a growing humanitarian catastrophe. The political situation is on a knife edge. For every positive news report, we see continued violence and obstacles to continued negotiations. There is no doubt that decisions made by the Houthi rebel group in the next few weeks will determine the outcome of Yemen's future. Their coup, which began this crisis, has probably gone further than they initially intended. After dissolving parliament and declaring their intention to form a government, the Houthis very nearly triggered a civil war. Internal pressure from political parties and tribal groups, and external pressure through the condemnation from the UN Security Council, and a strong stance by regional powers like Saudi Arabia, have brought the Houthis back to the negotiating table. With this window of opportunity presented to us, I hope the United Kingdom, and this minister in particular, can play a role in mediation. We should not... Yes, of course.
But can you just clarify, as an expert in this area, like in many other areas, who actually does he think backs the Houthi rebels, and how do we get those backers to stop backing this evil organisation?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. We need to look to see who is supporting them. He has said Iran, and we need to find out what pressure we can put on them. I think our ability to influence Iran is pretty limited, but this is a very important factor. As we know from Middle East politics, and he is also very greatly interested in this area, it is not necessarily just the people at the front. So he's right that we should look at intentions. Can I say this about President Hadi? A number of honourable and right honourable members have met President Hadi, either in his current position or before he became president. He's now fled from the capital. In my view, and I hope the view of the government, he's the only individual who maintains democratic legitimacy in Yemen's current political system, if indeed we can call it that. We need him to support any proposals, as he maintains a strong following in the country. Last week, the governors of the provinces of Aden, Lahaj and Mahra demanded the reinstatement of Mr. Hadi and reaffirmed their support for Yemen becoming a federation of 6 regions. It is vital that pro-Houthi and pro-Hadi groups do not set the spark for an escalation of the violence. My apologies, Mr. Chairman. Last Friday's preliminary agreement by the rival parties to form a People's Transitional Council is something the United Kingdom and international community should rally behind as a solution. Jamal Binoma, the United Nations mediator, has described the agreement as an important breakthrough that paves the way towards a comprehensive agreement. Under this agreement, Yemen's House of Representatives will stay in place, which will appease the former ruling party, who hold a clear majority there. Instead of the traditional upper house, a new transitional council will consist of traditionally unrepresentative sectors amongst Yemen's formerly independent south, women and young people. This is positive, but the agreement is incredibly fragile, and if one party withdraws support, the entire deal may collapse, as we have seen before. The United Kingdom and the international community needs to keep this agreement on track. All of our work that we did in 2011 and all of our progress since would be back to square one. We should not allow the political process to reverse any further. One of my requests to the Minister is that we take the lead in maintaining these negotiations. Can we please speak to the United States, European and especially regional allies, as the Honourable Member for Hexham has said, to pull the international community behind the Transitional Council and offer our officials to assist the United Nations in their mediation. The fragility of the political situation is strongly affected by the violence which has erupted across the country. Rival groups are clashing in the streets, but those that oppose and those who support the Houthi rebels. I have been informed by various charities operating in the region, including Islamic aid organisations and United Nations organs, that these clashes are escalating and protesters have been kidnapped, injured or killed. Indeed, I have been informed that the majority of journalists have fled the country as the risk of kidnap or injury is so high. This part explains the appallingly absent media's coverage of the country's downward spiral. By all indicators, levels of violence are dramatically increasing. UNICEF have informed me that there is a 40% increase of children being killed or maimed. There is a 47% increase in the use of child soldiers. There has been repeated cases of children killed around their own schools. In one example, in December 2014, 15 young children were killed travelling to school by bomb attacks. Schools are being used for military purposes as barracks, bases and firing positions. One huge problem is the number of firearms available. There are between 8 million and 11.5 million guns in civilian hands in the country. Yemen is second in the world for gun ownership, at 54.8 guns per 100 people. For civilians going about their lives, they are now regularly stopped by groups of armed men in hastily established checkpoints as loosely affiliated tribal and armed groups fill the security vacuum. Meanwhile, tribal groups in the south have repeatedly fought with Houthi troops. It is vital that the violence does not escalate further. Groups loyal to President Hadi seized government buildings in Yemen last week, clashing with pro-Houthi security forces, leading to a number of fatalities. This is a real flashpoint. We in the West may not recognise the seriousness of these developments, but regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are incredibly concerned. If we are a peripheral player, our ability to influence the actions of these regional powers, who are pushing for a military solution, will be extremely limited. These clashes need to end immediately before the various factions lose faith in a non-military solution. Can we please support the government, those forces still loyal to the government, and provide them with more support? Whilst an intervention involving the United Kingdom is clearly not a likely prospect, what other support or incentives can we provide to deter further violence? Are these carrots and sticks which we in the international community can apply in any ongoing negotiations? Because we need them if we are going to make any more progress. From a Western perspective, one of the most worrying developments is the expanding power of extremist Islamic organizations linked to terrorist activity. One of the most dangerous of these groups is the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, described by the CIA as one of the most dangerous terrorist groups in the world. This is the group which trained Saeed Kushi, one of the Charlie Hebdo killers. He received military training in Yemen in 2011. Parts of Yemen already serve as a safe haven for the group, where they direct operations and release propaganda through the internet. This is a huge problem. Last year, 3,200 UK passport holders travelled to Yemen. The group is known to train potential terrorists who want to use their newfound skills, such as bomb making, on the streets of London. And by all accounts, they are benefiting from the current power vacuum. On the 12th of February, an Al-Qaeda-linked group, Ansar al-Sharia, successfully stormed a military base in the southern town of Bayham, capturing between 1,000 and 2,000 soldiers and military equipment. It fell after several hours of fighting. The United States has had a long and positive relationship with security forces in Yemen in targeting terrorist organizations. After initially putting strikes on hold, then restarting them, the long-term future of this relationship is sadly unclear. We cannot lose such a strong ally in the fight against terrorism. One of our priorities must be to maintain this relationship, whichever group comes out on top in this political situation. We cannot allow Al-Qaeda to gain any more territory and any more influence. The long-term answer to the issue of Al-Qaeda is a strong Yemeni government with our close relationship ongoing. However, we need to better monitor individuals travelling to the country and work with the authorities there in order to do so. We also need to recall that Turkey is the gateway to the Middle East for individuals trying to join groups such as ISIL and Al-Qaeda. We need better exit checks and cooperation in place. Finally, let me turn to the humanitarian crisis. All of these factors are risking an unimaginable humanitarian crisis across Yemen. Yemen is already the most impoverished country in the region and has one of the worst records for malnutrition in the world. UNICEF has provided me with the latest humanitarian figures, which are dreadful. 8.4 million people lack access to basic healthcare services. 850,000 children under 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition. 160,000 of these are at severe fatal risk. Young girls are particularly vulnerable to abuse and FGM, with a staggering 83% of girls aged between 10 and 14 experiencing some form of physical abuse. Overall, 15 million people currently need humanitarian assistance. The United Kingdom has a very good record in providing assistance to Yemen, and I have paid tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton and my Right Honourable friend, the Member for Harrow East, for all the work they have done as international development ministers. However, the situation has got much worse, even since the Prime Minister's envoy was in office. Though the government has been very helpful, the Minister of State for International Development, the current Minister of State, has informed me that £9.5 million will be added to our existing £35 million nutrition programme. I also understand that we have fulfilled our commitments as co-chairs of the Friends of the Yemen Group, and our development programmes are making a real difference. But we cannot do this alone. We want to make sure that the other friends of Yemen who promised billions to this country, but I'm afraid have delivered very little. What support is being provided by other EU countries? Could we please hold an emergency meeting of the Friends of Yemen so that we can get an aid package together? If we do not do so, then the country, if it descends into civil war, will face bitter consequences for not just the people of Yemen, but also for the people of the region. When Yemen faced such a crisis in 2011, the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and the Prime Minister stepped in and made a decisive difference. I can remember speaking to the Prime Minister about this, and I know he feels very strongly that the action of the British government was important. Yemen was pulled back from the brink on that occasion and put back on the path to democracy. I feel that the United Kingdom is in a unique position to effect positive change in Yemen. Now is the time for us to step up and take that urgent action. The UN Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, has recently said, Yemen is collapsing before our eyes. We can't stand by and watch. If civil war breaks out, it'll be as complicated and intractable a conflict as is possible to see anywhere in the world, including in Syria. And I don't believe that we will be able to stand by and do no more. We need to be prepared to work with the international community in order to stop this crisis developing any further. If Yemen falls, Mr. Caton, the front line of this conflict will be the streets of London, of Birmingham, and Leicester. We are bound by our historical ties with this country to do more. We cannot allow this beautiful country to become a haven for terrorism and violence. I urge the Minister to act decisively and to act now.
Thank you, Mr. Caton, for chairing this debate this morning. I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman both for arranging this debate and for every single word that he's just said. I agree with all of it, and I think what this illustrates is that this is very much a cross-party issue. And I think by joining together across this House to focus on Yemen, we're doing the world a very important service, because, as he rightly says, it cannot just be parked into a corner and isolated as a poor corner of the Arabian Peninsula that doesn't matter and has no effect on everything else, because it most certainly does. And perhaps the most important sentence of his comments this morning were that if it goes wrong, a lot else goes wrong with it. And that's what I think needs to govern our thinking and shape our conclusions. The Right Honourable Gentleman can claim 50 years of experience in Yemen. I can only claim 30, initially going as an oil trader, but then taking a political and then a ministerial interest in the country. When I first went, as when he was there, one could travel in Sana'a and from Sana'a to Aden. At the moment, no such journey is possible in safety. And that illustrates the deterioration of the country, which we now need to focus on. While I was a DFID minister, I tried to raise the profile of Yemen in government for the very reasons the Right Honourable Gentleman articulates. It is more dangerous and more significant than people think. And it also has had a long-term humanitarian need, where many, many children, a high percentage under the age of 5, are stunted, and where a large percentage don't know where their next meal was coming from. And that was before the deterioration we've seen over the last few months. So the United Kingdom has been committing a direct budget of about £70 million a year to Yemen's needs, which, when you apportion what we give to the United Nations and multilateral organisations, is perhaps double that figure in effect. So we are well over £100 million in what we're giving to Yemen, and in my view, that is necessary money. It is being well spent, or has been so far, and also perhaps the money that I'm most proud of was the £1 million I committed as a minister to launch Jamal Ben Ammar as the United Nations Special Representative, who over the last few years has been crucial to the negotiations which have held the country together to today. But I think to understand the country, we need to step back perhaps a few centuries, but at the very least a few years, to what we know has happened in what we call the Arab Spring, because it was not the same in Yemen as it was in, say, Libya, or Tunisia, or even Egypt, where across Arabia or Arab-speaking countries, some have changed regime by violent conflict. Others, within the GCC, have sustained current regimes because they have greater resources with which to reach an accommodation with their own people. But Yemen was very much unique in that through the GCC initiative, it, with the minimum of conflict, was able to effect a presidential transition and move from one president to another without the violence we've seen elsewhere. And this transition got Yemen off to a very, very good start in the context of the disruption that we saw elsewhere in Arabia. And it was a GCC initiative supported by Jamal Ben Ammar and, of course, by the likes of the UK and the US. And it has allowed Yemen to, let's put it honestly, muddle along for the last 3 or so years without collapsing into a complete mess. So in that sense, Yemen has not been like any other country. It started, of course, unlike any other country, because it has a weak government at the centre and very powerful satellite interests, commanded by what one might loosely call warlords, within the country. And that has always created a very, very difficult problem of balancing power and influence and of attracting enough power into the centre to give it an effective and purposeful government which can be said to be legitimate and doing what is necessary for the people. Yes?
To the Right Honourable Gentleman given way, with his expertise in the area, and I pay tribute to the work he's done, he's talking about the different factions in Yemen, looking at the national dialogue, looking at where it's been and where we are now. How do we move forward by ensuring that everyone who has a stake in Yemen comes round the table and can effectively move the country forward?
Well, I say, Mr. Caton, this is exactly the right question. Because what emerged from the GCC initiative was a plan for exactly that kind of unifying national dialogue within the country. It was a plan to bring together all parts, all sections, and all interests in the country to agree a path towards a constitutional settlement which could lead to proper, legitimate, and respected elections. And that remains the objective of what we need to see yet return from the difficulties the country faces. So my honourable friend is absolutely right in saying that this strand of discussion and unifying constitutional debate within the country is the glue, and if you like, they are the components which still stand to bring the country together. What also came along with the GCC initiative were donor pledges, $6 or $7 billion at a pledging conference arranged by the Friends of Yemen, co-chaired by the UK and the Saudis, and an IMF package which was on the brink of being implemented before things deteriorated. And the dialogue my honourable friend mentions did come to a conclusion, but it has not yet been fully implemented with the subsequent actions that are necessary to make it affect the changes that are planned. Because the tragedy is the GCC initiative and the stability we hoped for in the country has disintegrated over the last 6 months. Now, what has happened is that the Houthis, if you like, soft Shia, the Zaydis, focused mostly in the north, who comprise a maximum of perhaps 30% of the country, have taken arms and advanced on the capital city. Now, Yemen is not an habitual sectarian country. It is far more tribal than it is sectarian. But this does begin to introduce a possible and dangerous sectarian element in the complex power play in Yemen itself. And hence, again, the honourable member's reference to Iran has validity, although I don't think that the absolutist terms in which he describes it reflect what is actually happening in the country. Iran, it could be said, backs rather than directs the Houthis. But what matters is what is happening inside the country. one more time, and then I'm just going to
point.
this on.
When he talks about Iran rather than backs rather than directs, but even if it backs rather than directs, it has leverage on the Houthis. And on that basis, if it has leverage by backing them, it should use that leverage if it wants to be part of the international community with relation to the nuclear deal that's coming up.
Well, I refer to what I just said a moment ago, if I may, that no life is quite so simple as that, but I understand what his view is. So let's just look at what has happened. The Houthis, perhaps against people's expectations, largely because they'd overtaken the battalion in Amran and taken their heavy weapons, were able to advance on Sana'a and pretty well march into the capital city uncontested. But what they were supposed to have done just before they did that was to have adhered to a firm agreement that was reached on the 21st of September last year, the PNPA, the Peace and National Partnership Agreement, which should have said, you've gone this far, now hold it, muck in, and work with everybody else to find a solution. And they have not adhered to the terms of the PNPA. So what we have seen by advancing into Sana'a is that the Houthis have displaced the government, but they have not replaced it with any form of government that can be called such. So what we have now is effectively a vacuum. But there is also an element of this which is utterly unacceptable, and that is the placing of legitimate, continuing ministers under house arrest. President Hadi, fortunately, at the weekend, escaped. But Khaled Baha, who is the Prime Minister of Yemen, remains under house arrest, and he and others who have been put under house arrest must be released by the Houthis and allowed to go free. I've spoken to Khaled Baha regularly. It is not right that he is detained under house arrest in the way that he is. We have also seen a very strong United Nations Security Council statement, and that is an essential part of the pressure that needs to be put on what is happening in Yemen at the moment. So, Mr. Caton, the next few weeks are crucial. Yemen is really more on the brink today than people have said that it has been for many, many years. Jamal Benomar is doing his very best and deserves our full support. He is slaving away in Sana'a, trying to hold the country together and reach some kind of accommodation between all the competing parties, and he deserves our full support, as do all the efforts in the UN to try and put pressure on what is happening in the country. This is essential, and the Minister will say more, I've no doubt, on all of this, but I'd like to echo what the Right Honourable Gentleman said, which is about the danger we are looking at. The list, when it all comes together, if it all goes wrong together, is potentially cataclysmic. We are looking at a country in the southern Arabian Peninsula, close to Somalia, where there is people trafficking and things like that, where guns can run through the country and all kinds of risk can be nurtured. That it might have no government and hence ungoverned, anarchic space. We are looking at a country that could collapse into tribal anarchy and the absence of any kind of order and government whatsoever. We are looking at the risk of tribal conflict. This is a tribal more than it is a sectarian country. And that tribal conflict could become very vicious. As my right honourable friend says, right honourable gentleman says, there are more weapons than people. And when they start firing at each other, there is no end to what could go wrong. That tribal conflict could collapse into civil war. There have been civil wars in Yemen before. The latest was in 1994, and it could easily happen even within the next few weeks if things go terribly wrong. As part of that civil war, you could once again see the division of the country between north and south, where there are fewer people and more resources in the south, and many more people and fewer resources in the north. So even if one liked the idea of a nicely contained southern Yemen, it's inconceivable that the north would accept it as an option when they would feel deprived and starved of resources. We are looking at the danger of Al-Qaeda being free to train and run riot, perhaps not just in southern Yemen, but more widely across the country. We are perhaps looking at a proxy Cold War, which could become a hot one, between the Iranians and the Saudi Arabians fought out in Yemen because of their competing interests. And amidst all of these ingredients, you're also looking at the awful danger of economic collapse and deep humanitarian disaster. Not just food, but also disease and people trafficking and everything else that goes with it. So I'm sure that, as the Minister will say, it's important to work with the whole of the GCC, and especially with Saudi Arabia and Oman, who are the immediate neighbours, and with the United States, and, lest anyone belittle them, the United Nations as well, who have proved so crucial, both in the political negotiations and in the delivery of health and other needs in the country. So, Mr. Caton, President Hadi remains the legitimate head of state, but he has become separated from the functions of effective government. And somehow, legitimacy and effectiveness need to be remarried in a settlement which puts Yemen back on the path to some kind of stable government which people accept, which can avoid the conflict and disaster which at the moment is looming if there is no such quick and effective solution.
Elton.
Thank you, Mr. Caton. I just want to add a few words in support of the Right Honourable Member for Leicester East in bringing a hugely neglected subject to the attention of this House. It is a neglected part of the Middle East, and yet, as the Honourable Gentleman has mentioned, it is crucial to the security of the region and indeed the wider world. It also plays a strategic position in trade. Some 5% of the world's oil trade goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and is an important trade route, obviously. And of course, the situation has greatly worsened in recent weeks, and with the news just last week that the United Kingdom, the United States and France have all closed their embassies in that country. So the ambassador will no longer be able to offer his bed to the Right Honourable Member if the opportunity afforded itself again in the future. Now, I well remember the trip with the Right Honourable Member for Leicester East some years ago. It was a fascinating journey. It was probably the most extraordinary country I have ever visited. The trip involved something of a pilgrimage to pay homage to the birthplace of the Right Honourable Member for Leicester East at the Queen Elizabeth II Hospital in Aden, where we were able, with the aid of several television cameras, to dig out the birth records of the Right Honourable Member. After an overland trip from Sana'a to Aden, which the Right Honourable Member promised would only take 3 or 4 hours, we started off at 9 o'clock and arrived at 11:30 at night, and with the noble Lord Kilclooney amongst our number, was convinced we had been kidnapped by a tribe halfway on our journey at one stage. And in fact, such was the security situation that the ambassador was only allowed to travel by air, not by land, but we, being mere dispensable MPs, were able to travel by land. But what we saw on that trip, apart from an extraordinary country apparently still deeply entrenched in the Middle Ages in many respects, but one that was deeply stricken with poverty, and one could see the potential for the encroachment of extremism into some deeply impoverished communities who had little else to survive for and were easily tempted by extremist voices who offered some form of hope out of their despair on the face of it. And it is that form of poverty which gives rise to extremism and everything that goes with it. And that's why our international aid effort in the wider world, but particularly in Yemen, is so necessary. And I think we can take particular pride with the resources that we have put into alleviating poverty and malnutrition and those severe problems which the Right Honourable Gentleman enumerated in his speech earlier. We also visited the port of Aden. This was one of the great ports of colonial times. It was the fueling station for the British fleet travelling to India. And yet it is a port in huge decay, very little activity going on. It is a vast deep water port that still has the potential to be a major economic player as a staging post in the Middle East. And it's disappointing, therefore, that when an attempt at investment in that country in 2008, I think it was, where the state of Dubai invested in the Dubai Port Company, invested in the Aden port and had the concession for the port of Aden, only for that concession to be relinquished in 2012 because it was said that, in fact, Dubai was not investing in the port and was just seeking to keep it in mothballs because of the effect it might have on its own interests in Dubai itself. That, Mr. Caton, seems to be a major potential to try and regenerate some economic growth in that country with huge implications if we can get it right. But clearly when we went some 8 years ago, I think, 7, 8 years ago on our visit, there were large parts of the country which were effectively no-go areas, and we were unfortunately unable to visit much outside of Sana'a and Aden itself. Yet this is the poorest country in the Arabian Peninsula, yet it's the second most populous. And quite aside from all the problems it has at the moment, its environmental problems can only get worse. It is a water-poor country. It's effectively going to run out of sufficient water resources within the next 15 to 20 years unless there can be some serious investment in water management in that country, including desalination plants. And of course it has virtually no oil like its wealthy neighbours. The other thing that struck me on our visit there was the great links between our country and Yemen, the colonial links that go back with Aden. Indeed, I have veterans in my own constituency in Worthing who remember being in the army who were withdrawn from Aden abruptly by the Wilson government back in 1965, I think it was, when things kicked off there, from which ensued some 25 years of chaos in that country, effectively, with various civil wars, the dismemberment between the north and the south before Yemen eventually was put back together in the 1990s. But we met many cabinet ministers, highly Anglophile, highly articulate, many with children, if not themselves, at universities in the United Kingdom, with interests in the United Kingdom, who spoke very fondly of the United Kingdom. And it always struck me as extraordinary that we didn't have a closer relationship, and indeed why that country wasn't part of the Commonwealth, for example, given some of the culture and background that we both share. So there are people in positions of responsibility in that country, and certainly were, who are an obvious form of dialogue and discussion and potential cooperation with Western nations, and particularly with the United Kingdom. So we have an open door for British government to play a significant role, continue to play a significant role in the future of that troubled part of the Arabian Peninsula. But as the Right Honourable Gentleman quite rightly said in his opening remarks, the future and the solutions to Yemen will largely rely on their partner states within the Arabian Peninsula and indeed the wider Middle East. Yemen will require financial backing. Indeed, we've heard about the abortive attempts to raise donor backing in the Friends of Yemen conference some years ago, in which we played such a strategic role. But Saudi Arabia has from time to time injected large quantities of money into Yemen in order to prevent economic collapse, but also, of course, because many economic migrants from Yemen have come into Saudi Arabia. Now, back in the 1990s, of course, at the time of the first Gulf War, for extraordinary reasons, when the president of Yemen backed Saddam Hussein, and managed, therefore, to alienate himself from all the Allied forces and Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. Some 1 million Yemeni workers were expelled from Saudi Arabia and had to return to Yemen. And that caused huge economic hardship. Recently, there has been a further crackdown on illegal labourers in Saudi Arabia back in April of 2013, and hundreds of thousands of Yemeni workers were again expelled back into Yemen. This has had huge economic implications. So the cooperation of Saudi Arabia is absolutely key to getting some form of stability in Yemen. But of course, at a time when the country is in the hands of militant Shia groups of one description or the other, the Saudi Arabians are understandably loath to underwrite further loans to that country, not knowing what the future of that country actually is. And indeed, I gather there are moves afoot at the moment to erect a 1,500-kilometre fence across the whole of the Saudi-Yemeni border, a very porous and fluid border, across which many al-Qaeda terrorists and others have, of course, moved from north to south and vice versa over many years. And then there's the role of Qatar as well, who invested a not unsubstantial sum of money some years ago in real estate in Sana'a. One dreads to think what state that particular investment is in at the moment. But the point, Mr. Caton, is that the cooperation, working in partnership of those neighbouring Gulf state countries is absolutely key. And there's a final point as well, which has only just been touched on by various honourable members, and that is the more strategic, the greater, almost the great game role being played out between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence within that country, whether it's backing a particular government at the moment, whether it's supporting it in different other ways or not. Yemen is almost in the middle of what's been called a Saudi-Iranian Cold War. And again, we need to have the cooperation of both of those countries in finding a solution to that country, because it's not in the interests of either Saudi Arabia or Iran for Yemen to become a training ground for terrorists who will wreak havoc in those other countries, Arab and non-Arab, within the Middle East, as well as the wider Western world. That country is harbouring terrorists, despite the intention of the previous democratic government to try and clamp down on them. As the Right Honourable Member has said, the huge instance of arms in that country gives rise to serious concerns. And there will be a domino effect if we cannot contain the situation, regularise the situation, and bring back stability in Yemen, where those terrorists trained on the streets of Sana'a, or more likely in desert training camps, will end up trying to do harm and wreak mayhem in the capital cities of Europe. So, Mr. Caton, this is a neglected and little understood country in the middle of the world, in the Middle East, strategically, geographically in a very important location, but as a matter of security, one which plays potentially a very significant role that we ignore at our peril. So I applaud the effort that the British government has made over many years and on both sides of the House. It is not a partisan matter. It has been absolutely essential to be at the table trying to broker partnerships to bring economic stability and security to that country. It's been absolutely essential, hand in hand with that, for the direct aid that we have given that is so essential in trying to rescue some of the poorest people in the world who are so vulnerable to fall into the hands of terrorists. So I look forward to what the Minister has to say. This is a very difficult situation, a very frustrating situation, one where we've seen many false dawns, but one where it's absolutely essential that we should not hold back from continuing to take a strong interest and to take a strong lead in that country. And if we can bring about a solution, then that will be a great tribute to the efforts of this government, but it can only be done in partnership with all those other nations in that region. And Britain, probably more than any other Western power, is best placed to bring that about.
Gareth Thomas.
Mr. Caton, I congratulate my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the member for Leicester East, on securing this debate, and in doing so at such a critical time for Yemen's future. As he rightly alluded to, Mr. Caton, Yemen matters, not just in terms of counter-terrorist actions against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and which recent events in Paris only served to underline the importance of. But Yemen matters crucially also because of its strategic importance in the region, a point I think the honourable member for East Worthing and indeed the honourable member for Rutland and Melton rightly dwelled on. But Yemen matters also because of our close ties with the people of Yemen, stretching back through our imperial past, and the urgent need to offer economic and social hope for the citizens of Yemen at this particularly difficult point. So this debate is very timely. It's important, I think, to look at the context that the people of Yemen are experiencing at the moment. Yemen remains one of the poorest countries in the region and worldwide. Poverty and inequality, according to DFID, have increased over the last 15 years, with the result that at least 10% of the population live on less than $1.25 a day, and over a third on less than $2 a day, according to the most recent World Bank figures. It's worth stressing that those figures are from some time ago, and the conflict at the moment can only have served to increase the scale of poverty and deprivation in Yemen. Girls and women suffer in particularly severe discrimination, including high rates of early marriage and genital mutilation. And according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, some 15 million Yemenis, more than half of the population, require humanitarian assistance, with half of all children under 5 years old chronically malnourished. Now, the economic situation, if gloomy now, doesn't look much more optimistic in the medium or longer term either. Most of central government revenue comes from oil production, which is set to decline very sharply in the coming years. And Yemen faces major problems from declining water resources and rapid population growth. The limited competition, the considerable corruption, and above all the insecurity all mean that the private sector remains marginal, and civil society too is far from strong in Yemen too. But what is exacerbating a grim outlook for Yemenis economically and socially is, as other honourable members have already pointed out in considerable detail, the huge political and security uncertainty facing the country of Yemen. The rise of Houthi rebels, the presence of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the manoeuvrings of different tribal groups have all contributed to the sense of uncertainty and insecurity in Yemen. In addition, the close interest of Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen adds a further level of potential complication too. And my honourable friend alluded to my work in a previous role, having responsibility for our aid programme in Yemen. Amongst other things, I remember chairing what appeared to be a successful aid conference at Lancaster House almost 10 years ago. And I visited Yemen too to see our then aid programme on the ground, including meeting the then President, Mr. Salah. I remember that visit very well, not least because of the gold-plated AK-47 on the wall next to the President's then office, apparently a gift from Saddam Hussein to the one leader who'd recognised his brief conquest of Kuwait. But I remember it best for a wider visit to Sana'a Old Town, a remarkable city, as the Honourable Member for East Worthing and indeed my honourable friend too have alluded to. Even on that visit, the better part of 10 years ago, the insecurity was tangible. In the last 4 years, that insecurity has markedly increased. Following uprisings in the wake of the wider Arab Spring in 2011, and then a series of deadly clashes between protesters and government security forces, President Salah signed a transition agreement that had been brokered by the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, which included the transfer of power to his deputy, Mr. Adraba Mansour Hadi. In March 2013, as the honourable member, the right honourable member for Rutland and Melton rightly alluded to, a national dialogue conference convened with the aim of drafting a new constitution. That conference concluded in January last year, agreeing a document on which the new constitution would be based. Now, following the unrest of 2011, President Hadi was able to establish some stability, although the complex set of alliances and groupings in Yemen meant that the security forces remained very divided, and the government struggled even then to cope with the challenges posed by the Houthi rebels and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In September 2014, even that fragile arrangement collapsed when armed Houthi rebels seized control of large swathes of the capital, Sana'a. The government signed a peace and national partnership agreement which involved the formation of a new government and required Mr. Hadi, acting as caretaker president, to appoint a new prime minister. The agreement also led to the appointment of political advisers from the Houthi movement and the Southern movement, and was welcomed by the UN at the time, with the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urging all parties to implement the agreement without delay. Since the turn of this year, the situation has worsened dramatically. In January, as my honourable friend alluded to, Houthi rebels rejected a draft constitution put forward by the government and seized control of state TV. And President Hadi and his government resigned. His residence was attacked and he was placed under house arrest, as were the Prime Minister and many cabinet ministers. Earlier this month, the Houthi rebels dissolved Parliament and announced that a 5-member presidential council would replace the president. Jamal Ben-Ammar, the UN envoy to Yemen, said quite rightly on the 11th of February that we believe the situation is very dangerous and that Yemen is on the brink of civil war. I therefore welcome reports that a UN-brokered deal was struck on Friday to agree on a compromise legislative council, although I understand this falls short of a full new government with clear leadership. Mr. Ben-Ammar, I'm told, believes this agreement may pave the way for a comprehensive political agreement. I understand the agreement keeps the existing parliament in place, but adds a People's Transitional Council as a sort of second legislative chamber, drawing in members from the Houthis, as well as other underrepresented groups such as young people, women and those from southern Yemen. What apparently hasn't been decided is how a new president gets chosen, or indeed their cabinet. Mr. Hadi has been under house arrest until very recently, but like others in this chamber, I welcome the fact that he has managed to escape, and I share the honourable member for Rutland and Milton's view that his colleagues, including the Prime Minister, need to be immediately released by the Houthi rebels. Now, I look forward to hearing the Minister's view on the prospects for this deal and what steps the UK is taking to encourage discussions between the various groups to try and build consensus for further agreement. Jane Marriott, until very recently the UK's ambassador in Yemen, stated recently that the Gulf Cooperation Initiative provided the mechanisms for an inclusive political dialogue involving those groups who hadn't signed it, including the Houthis and Iraq. The UK was in regular contact with all groups, including the Houthis, during the national dialogue. They, like all groups, had legitimate grievances that were not being addressed quickly enough. I recognise that with the closure of our embassy, maintaining contacts with the different players in Yemen has been very difficult, but it would still be useful to hear from the Minister what contacts have been possible to be maintained. Further, I wonder if the Minister can set out what discussions the UK government has had with the Saudi Arabian government in their role as co-chairs of the Friends of Yemen regarding the support they're able to provide to encourage further political progress. As my honourable friend rightly asked, will the Friends of Yemen be meeting again before the dissolution of Parliament next month? And what discussions has the Minister or his colleagues had with our EU colleagues, who will also be critical in both providing further humanitarian aid, but who will also be important in encouraging a collective way forward? There have long been, as the honourable member for somewhere in Kent, I beg your pardon, Gillingham, thank you, alluded to, the accusations that Iran is supporting the Houthi movement. There clearly are links, but it would be helpful, I think, to hear from the Minister his assessment of the allegations of Iran's role, if any, in Yemen's recent history, and what discussions he or ministerial colleagues have had with Tehran, perhaps in the margins of discussions about the nuclear deal, about progress in Yemen. Lastly, my honourable friend also rightly raised concerns about the continuing presence and indeed strength of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There is concern that the progress that the Houthis have made has helped Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to strengthen their position, which, if accurate, is particularly troubling. My honourable friend rightly too talked of the need for better oversight of individuals travelling to Yemen, and it would be good to hear the Minister's reflections on that particular point. My honourable friend and others who've already spoken have done the House a service in raising the situation in Yemen, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's response.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Caton. It's a pleasure to work under your chairmanship, and can I say it is also a pleasure to respond to what I thought has been a very informative and I think interesting debate, and shows this House at its best, because the amount of knowledge that we have seen that has been presented by the various contributors shows that this is an important issue and that Britain has very much a role to play. Can I also thank the Backbench Business Committee for selecting this, and pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Leicester East for pursuing this issue not just here today, but on a number of occasions where he has brought this matter to the floor of the House, and I hope he continues to do that. It is right that this House debates developments in a country which is a key partner for delivery, specifically on counter-terrorism objectives. If I may, Mr. Caton, just to place the country into historical and geographical context, as I'm sure honourable members know, Yemen lies at the southern end of the Arab Peninsula, bordering Saudi Arabia to the north and Oman to the east. And in biblical times, Yemen was known by Noah as the land of milk and honey. The three wise men are said to have presented baby Jesus with myrrh and frankincense from the mountains in Yemen. And others also claim it is the home of the Queen of Sheba. In modern times, Britain has had strong historic links with Yemen. Aden was colonised during the 19th century and developed and became an important staging post on the sea routes to India, as my honourable friend for East Worthing and Shoreham has mentioned. But Britain was later forced to leave Aden following local insurgency in 1967. More recently, times have been less pleasant, and following an 8-year civil war between the Saudi-backed royalists and the Egyptian-backed republicans, the republics of North and South Yemen were established in 1970. Then in 1990, the Marxist South Yemen merged with the Northern Republic, and 4 years later, unhappy with Northern oppression, the South fought and lost a brief war of secession. Yemen was struck by further political upheaval in 2011 when thousands took to the streets to force out the then President Saleh after 3 decades in power. Saleh later resigned at the end of 2011 as part of the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative, the GCCI deal, which signalled the start of Yemen's political transition. Since then, that political transition in Yemen has been making steady progress. The National Dialogue Conference, that's been mentioned by a number of honourable members, agreed a vision for Yemen, which then went on to form the basis of the new constitution, and we saw a first draft of that in January this year, which the opposition spokesman alluded to. Regrettably, since September last year, the Houthis, who are a political and cultural and a Shiite Zaidi religious movement from the North Yemen, making up 1/3 of the population and ruled the north until 1962, staged a takeover of the legitimate government of President Hadi and key state institutions to put the whole transition process in jeopardy. The Houthi use of military means to achieve political aims is something we cannot accept. It is a clear violation of the 1994 Yemeni constitution and the principles of the GCC initiative. Descent into further civil conflict is now a strong possibility, and the threat posed by al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula to the Yemeni state, as well as our own national security, remains real. Recent events in Yemen threaten our stability to deliver our core objective to Yemen, to disrupt al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula and their ability to launch aviation-based attacks against the UK and partners, to address the urgent humanitarian situation facing the poorest people in the country, and bring about greater stability through the more inclusive political system that respects the rule of law. We still want to see a stable, democratic and prosperous Yemen. Yemen is a key partner in the UK's national counter-terrorism objectives against al-Qaeda, and we contribute large amounts of development aid, over $300 million over the last 3 years, to help 16 million Yemenis who do not have access to basic food or services, and humanitarian developments, as well as stable politics, are fundamental to securing a stable and peaceful future. The dust has not yet settled since the Houthi takeover, and events continue to evolve. The worst-case outcome is that the Houthis may unilaterally come to dominate the executive and continue their expansion into the largely Sunni governance of the south. This could lead to a bloody civil war and greater instability. I will.
In giving way, in relation to finding a peaceful, long-term solution in Yemen, does he have any indication if the Houthis are prepared to accept UN Resolution 2201, which ensures that all parties must come together and that the Houthis must withdraw from all government institutions immediately?
I'm developing my argument, and I will certainly come to that. But yes, that is the core of what we're doing, is working with the UN Special Envoy. Indeed, we were integral in drafting that particular resolution, and that exactly is where we want all parties to come to, but particularly the Houthis. In recent months, there has been an increase in al-Qaeda attacks, mainly targeting the Houthi and giving a more sectarian tone to what is essentially a struggle for power and territory rather than an ideological battle. Instability in Yemen increases the risk of opportunist al-Qaeda attacks and allows al-Qaeda to exploit the power vacuum and to project violence beyond Yemen's borders. The better outcome for Yemen would be a more representative executive that returns to the political roadmap in line with the GCC initiative. And to achieve this, all parties should recommit to the principles of this GCC initiative, the NDC recommendations, and the Peace and National Partnership Agreement. This agreement which the Houthis indeed signed before they actually moved into the capital. And, of course, agreeing to the United Nations Security Council resolutions 2201. While the Houthis have indeed engaged in the political process, such as taking part in the NDC talks over the new constitution, they have repeatedly failed to implement the measures that they have agreed to. Their actions to date spoken far louder than their words. But I, as my honourable friend for Rutland and Melton has paid tribute to, could I also commend the work of our former ambassador, Jane Marriott, and her staff for all their efforts to deliver our core counter-terrorism, stability and humanitarian objectives in such a difficult operating environment. Recent events in Yemen will hinder our ability to deliver our objectives in Yemen, and it is with regret that we have had to temporarily suspend embassy operations and withdraw diplomatic staff from Sana'a. We will continue to work remotely in support of Yemen's transition under the leadership of our new ambassador, Edmund Fitton-Brown. I'll just finish this point. We hope to return to Yemen as soon as the security conditions improve, and will make an announcement in due course. I give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm most grateful to the Minister for giving way. Just on the practicalities, now that our staff have been evacuated from Sana'a, if someone is seeking to apply for a visa to come to the United Kingdom, perhaps to study here or to visit a relative here, what is the new process by which they can obtain their visa?
We are making an announcement very shortly on where the new embassy will be will be located. And once that happens, then the normal processes will then apply. But he raises an important point. If I can, I will write to him with more details. The Friends of Yemen, the organisation that brings together many countries around the region, which Britain is proud to co-chair, met at the UN General Assembly in September last year. And all countries were committed to encouraging the Houthis to enter into dialogue with the other stakeholders. My honourable friend for East Worthing and Shoreham talked about the slow pace in which funds were not coming through, even though they had been pledged in 2012, I understand, at a previous UN General Assembly. Money is available, but it needs to be unlocked. But there also needs to be the institutions in place in the capital for the money to actually be transported and spent in a transparent and appropriate way. Those aspects of it has broken down, but we shouldn't forget that those pledges of around $10 billion were made in 2012. I understand only less than $5 billion was actually sort of committed as such. So there are international funds available, but that will only come about once the political situation has indeed improved. I will, yes.
I'm very grateful. I do apologise for missing the earlier part of the debate. But while he's on this particular issue, the placing of funds from the Friends of Yemen into Yemen depends crucially on the commitment of Yemenis themselves to have the means to deliver to the people who are poorest, to ensure that jobs are there. And too many states have put money into Yemen in the past and found it not being used effectively because of problems within government. Is my honourable friend sort of more assured that this is really understood so that this money can be unlocked? Because it's not just political will that's necessary, it is economic competence and delivery that is also key to making sure that money is used effectively.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and could I pay tribute to the work that he's done in this area, his time as Minister in the Foreign Office. And he raises a very powerful point. It's also been mentioned of the unique position that Britain finds itself in compared with other countries, and the leading role that Britain should actually play. And part of that role has been to communicate with the Houthis and indeed with the other stakeholders to make them aware of the consequences, not just of the grander consequences of civil war, but also the positives that once the structures actually are in place, once that there is stability, then we can actually unlock these funds. But an indication of the instability that is taking place is that Britain has had to evacuate its embassy, along with the Americans and indeed others, the EU base as well. Until they're able to sort of return back, then I'm afraid it will be much slower in order to make sure that these funds, these much needed funds to help those who are caught up in the war, can actually be spent appropriately. The regional implications for instability in Yemen are serious, as honourable members have mentioned. The increasingly sectarian nature of the conflict between the Shia Houthi and the Sunni tribes in the south will play into the hands of al-Qaeda, and we must work closely with allies such as Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to ensure a coordinated and multinational response to the situation in Yemen. Now, a number of honourable members have mentioned the important role that Iran can play in this in the current situation that we face. We are in dialogue with Iran, and we need to make sure that they understand that they have a constructive role to play to make sure that we do not see a further degrading into a case of civil war. We also continue to work throughout with our embassy staff, and indeed the UN Special Envoy Mansour Ben Omar has been mentioned, and key allies to encourage all factions to work together to agree a political solution within the framework of the GCC initiative, including a clear timetable for constitutional reform and indeed elections. We remain concerned by the continued house arrest of the Prime Minister Baha and members of the Cabinet and are actively calling for their immediate release. No country can tackle terrorism alone, and Yemen is no exception. The scale of the challenge is huge, and in the longer term, continued instability in Yemen may mean an increase in risk of al-Qaeda external attacks, including attacks here in the UK. Al-Qaeda remains a major part of the global multi-million-pound kidnapping trade, which is directly targeted against the UK, the EU, the US, and other Western nationals. And through al-Qaeda extremist propaganda, they also seek to radicalize Muslims around the world and incite extremist violence, as illustrated, as honourable members have mentioned, in the horrific attack in Paris on the 7th of January. Addressing the underlying instability, political and economic problems in Yemen is essential to counter the al-Qaeda threat effectively. We have temporarily suspended counter-terrorism capacity building with the Yemeni security forces, but we are exploring options of how to re-engage with the Yemeni security forces on counter-terrorism capacity building activity in a human rights compliant manner. For operational reasons, members will appreciate I cannot comment in detail on this activity. We know the majority of Yemenis want the same things people elsewhere around the world want: a say in how their country is run, an education for them and their children, and a chance to have a good job and the chance to live in a peaceful and prosperous state. The economic stability is therefore as critical as the political stability. And the economic situation is sadly deteriorating fast, with almost zero growth, debt of 50% of GDP, and rapidly declining foreign reserves and growing fuel shortages. I will do. So you just stand up.
Firstly, I apologise for not being here earlier. This is a subject dear to my heart, as my dear friends, all three of us, remember Bickerji Cowerji, and I can't spell it, the toy shop that we all went to as children. But can I ask, you cannot say why our counter-terrorism training has been suspended, but it is crucial that we get involved to help the government to actually get a grip of counter-terrorism. It's so important, so we should go back there as fast as we can.
Mr. Caton, my honourable friend who I know is very experienced in these matters, makes a very important and powerful point. The terrorism aspects in Yemen as an incubator for terrorist groups is enormous. The potential for civil war, sadly, is enormous as well. And so us working with allies to make sure that we can return and work with the Yemenis is a priority. But we have to remember that we need a government to work with. And at the moment, there isn't a government. There is a president as such. The president himself actually continues in that particular office. But there is confusion as to the direction that we're currently going to. And this is why we are calling upon the Houthis and others to recognise the UN resolution that we're working towards, come back to the table and provide the political basis from which peaceful dialogue can then move forward. And but on the terrorist aspects itself, without key reforms, the future government struggle to manage not just the terrorism aspects of it, but also the finances that we spoke about earlier, in the face of the low oil prices and a burgeoning salary bill. International support will remain crucial to avoid economic disaster. We, as has been reiterated across this chamber, must remain engaged in what is going on. It is also important that Yemen avoids humanitarian disaster, and I pay tribute to the opposition spokesman's work that he's done whilst he was at DFID, and he brings a lot of expertise to this debate. With some 16 million Yemenis in need of humanitarian aid, Yemen's humanitarian crisis is second in scale only to that of Syria. There is a real risk that humanitarian needs will increase in the coming weeks and months if the economy deteriorates or conflict intensifies. The UN appeal is only 60% funded, and it is crucial that the international community maintains or increases its support to Yemen at this time. Now, my honourable friends already know that we have provided £185 million worth of aid to Yemen over the past 3 years through DFID programmes, and we are currently able to continue to deliver the vast majority of that programme, in particular our humanitarian and nutrition programmes, though we are keeping a close touch with our partners as events develop. The international response to recent events has been strong and united, and the UN Security Council unanimously adopted the UK Jordanian-led Resolution 2201, which deplored the unilateral actions taken by the Houthi and urges them to engage in good faith in the UN-brokered political negotiations to withdraw their forces from government institutions and safe release of those who remain under house arrest. Regrettably, the EU, the GCC and the US missions have also had to suspend their operations due to the deteriorating security situation. The future of the Yemen state is more uncertain than ever, and the current political crisis has re-energized those groups in the south who long to return to the days of an independent South Yemen. The UK and the United Nations Security Council remain in support of the unity, sovereignty and independence of Yemen. There are secessionist sentiments in parts of the south, and we support calls for a new state structure that would give greater autonomy to the south of Yemen, as agreed in the NDC. However, the future structure of the state is ultimately a question for the Yemeni people. Mr. Caton, in conclusion, despite the huge challenges that Yemen is facing today, I do think that there is a solution to get Yemen back on the right path. And this includes, firstly, the immediate end to violence and intimidation, particularly in the oil-rich province of Marib, and the release of the remaining cabinet members under house arrest. And I'm pleased that President Hadi is now safely and well and free from house arrest. Secondly, a swift and peaceful political transition. We urge all parties, in particular the Houthis, to implement the GCCI, the National Dialogue Conference outcomes, and the Peace and National Partnership Agreement that they signed originally in 2014. All parties should engage in good faith in the UN-brokered negotiations. And finally, a new executive to take urgent steps to improve the economic and humanitarian situation. The political roadmap must now become a reality. I can assure members that despite the temporary suspension of our embassy operations in the capital, Britain will continue to do what it can to help Yemen achieve a better future for all. Thank you.
Order. We can now move on to this morning's next debate, which is on police numbers in Wales. Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Caton, and I'm glad I came in early, actually, because I think I would probably wouldn't have made it. But thank you so much for calling me early to this debate. The reason I'm calling for this debate is everybody cares about police numbers. Everybody wants to feel safe in their homes, safe on the streets, and to walk the byways free of antisocial behaviour and other nuisance behaviour. However, Mr. Caton, I am concerned that in Wales in particular, we have seen decisions taken by this government which has meant Wales has lost 500 officers from its service. To break it down, North Wales has lost 92 officers, South Wales Police 154, and my own force in Gwent, I have lost 226 officers. Reduction in police numbers across Wales is the equivalent of Gwent Police losing a full third of its officers. The fall in numbers has a dramatic effect not just on our police, but our constituents and on our businesses. In fact, police have said unequivocally public safety is at risk. And on last Wednesday, Mr. Caton, I know public safety was in the minds of people in Newbridge when I attended a public meeting there, where we talked about the problems, in particular, of antisocial behaviour. And I felt sorry for the police officer. And he told me that, unfortunately, due to cuts, he couldn't bring in the CCTV they wanted. He couldn't cut down on the antisocial behaviour, and it was a real problem. It impacted on public safety throughout Newbridge. It seems to me research by the Police Federation has found the crime is not falling. It is instead not being reported or recorded incorrectly. In Wales, overall crime has risen by 3%. Violent crime is up a fifth, with 38,000 violent attacks and 14 murders. Sexual offences are up by a shocking 30%. It's not as if ministers can claim they didn't know this would happen. Back in 2011, the Welsh Assembly launched an inquiry into the impact of policing cuts. The evidence taken from this inquiry came from a wide range of civil society. The advice was compelling and the outcome clear. The cross-party committee in charge of the investigation stated in the report, cuts to police numbers would be damaging, they would impact on communities, and reverse progress made in the past decade. Equally, the Welsh Local Government Association said the reduction in police numbers would present a huge challenge for community safety and in continuing to tackle and reduce crime and disorder. It is clear the loss of police officers has had a dramatic effect on the safety of our communities. The government claims that it's only back office functions which have lost officers. While this may be the case, Mr. Caton, ministers do not recognise how important the so-called back office functions are to combating crime. Back office is just more than admin and HR. It is, amongst other things, anti-terrorism intelligence, child protection, domestic violence units, family liaison, witness service, and, most crucially of all, 999 call handlers. Can the Minister honestly say these functions are not absolutely vital to tackling crime? The reduction in the number of police numbers is not just making our community more unsafe, it's harming their prosperity. It is more difficult for businesses to succeed. This is especially true in retail. And I know of so many shops in this line who tell me of youngsters outside causing nuisance, causing antisocial behaviour, making people fearful of going into the shops to make purchases. And when they send them away, they usually get a mouthful of abuse. Equally, large supermarkets tell me, Tesco's, Asda's tell me, that they have an increase in shoplifters. In fact, shoplifting costs retailers over £600 million last year, with an average incident costing companies £241. Now, who's anti-business, Mr. Caton? A 36% on previous years. This is against the backdrop of where police in Wales are being forced to prioritise some crimes over others. Her Majesty's Inspector of the Constabularies recognised that the police force's reduced numbers of officers are having to make very difficult decisions. As a result, businesses are suffering, including with the unchecked increase in online and credit card fraud. Indeed, I raised this with the Prime Minister, where we talked about gangs putting together nuisance mail, tricking older and elderly people into giving up their life savings towards them because of these letters coming through the post. What is happening with that crime? There are people suffering with that as well. This damage to public safety and the impact on businesses will only get worse if these plans do continue. In my own area, as I said, Mr. Caton, Gwent Police have already lost 226 officers and 175 civilian staff. With the 22 million more to be cut by the force, a further 200 officers could lose their job. This would take the force, policing one of the most deprived areas in Europe, covering a geographical area of 1,500 kilometres, with a population of 556,000 to just 1,000 officers. I would like to give the opportunity to the Minister in her remarks to guarantee here and now this further reduction will not harm public safety. I fear the increases in crime we have seen in Wales, and in particular my local area, are just the beginning. To put it bluntly, Mr. Caton, the police in Wales and in Islwyn and in Gwent and all over the country are being stretched to breaking point. Many forces now find themselves at critical mass level, meaning to go any lower in terms of police numbers would put the public in serious danger. The government's approach to policing has been described by the Police Federation as chaotic and foolish. By reducing police budgets in such an aggressive way, the public are being put at serious risk of crime. It is contrary to take the advice of ministers. I believe ministers should take the advice given to them by the HMR Inspector of Constabulary. Worst of all these cuts to the budget, to the police numbers, has been done without any consultation. From a government that talks about localism, I think that's absolutely amazing. The Welsh Government were not asked their view on what policing should look like. The people of Wales were not asked what they would like from their police service. It is a disgrace that a wide-ranging funding changes impacting our communities was done without consulting either the people of Wales or its representatives. The scale and pace of police cuts in Wales are greater than any other public sector cut, either in England or Wales. Ministers are right. In these times, we have to face difficult situations, and we have to make hard choices. However, I believe that government has only one duty, and that is to ensure the safety of people. The truth is, by choosing our police services to reduce the numbers, the government has failed. In 2010, the Home Secretary was publicly warned reduction in police numbers would damage public safety. Sadly, this has proven correct. For over 4 years now, our communities have become less safe. Now, in the dying days of this Parliament, will the Minister, who is a Liberal Democrat, admit this government simply got it wrong? Will she apologise to victims who may never have experienced crime if there were more police? Will she commit this government to change course? I look forward to the Minister's responses. Our dedicated police officers deserve this, and the people of Wales deserve it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caton. What a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for East Lewin on securing this debate, and I recognise that issues connected with the strength and capability of policing in our communities continue, rightly, to be of interest to all honourable members. And I do apologise on behalf of the Policing Minister, who was unable to attend today because of prior diary commitments. I will obviously respond to the points made by the Honourable Member in a few moments, but before I do, I want to reflect on some significant achievements by police forces in Wales. Firstly, I think it is worth highlighting the contribution of Welsh police forces to the overall reduction in crime, which we've seen since this coalition took office. As we've said a number of times before, crime as measured by the Independent Crime Survey for England and Wales is down by more than a fifth since 2010, and now stands at the lowest level we've seen since the survey began in 1981. Chief constables and PCCs have demonstrated it is possible to deliver more for less and prioritise resources at the front line. And communities in Wales are safer now than they have been for decades. As elsewhere, Welsh forces are collaborating with each other and other public services to transform the policing landscape in Wales. And this is not only helping to achieve necessary savings, but it's also delivering better outcomes for the public. For example, North Wales Police and Cheshire Constabulary have recently merged their armed policing units to improve response times and cut costs. Dyfed Powys, Gwent and South Wales police forces collaborate across a number of areas, including firearms, crime recording, mobile data, forensics and procurement.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I do apologise for not realising the debate started early. I'm very concerned, Minister, and I would like your opinion on the fact that the Dyfed Powys Police Commissioner has withdrawn his funding for the monitoring of CCTV cameras. This was a partnership with the County Council, who quite clearly cannot make up the shortfall. Would she agree that this is very short-sighted, and whilst we have low crime figures now, could in fact start reversing that trend?
Well, as the Honourable Member knows, this is a matter that is for local decision by the local PCC. That is the whole point, to make the judgment on the spot as to what is or what is not the correct way to proceed. And I'm sure she is more than capable of taking this up with him directly. And I was going on to talk about Gwent. The Police and Crime Commissioner for Gwent, Ian Johnston, has also announced plans for a new victims hub that's going to bring together a range of agencies and organisations to enable the force to work more effectively and efficiently with victims of crime. And through the Police Innovation Fund, we have provided funding that will further enhance collaboration as well as improve digital working and introduce new means by which the public can make contact with their forces. In 14-15, Gwent and South Wales received £837,000 from the Innovation Fund to develop an app that will allow officers to record and upload statements from a crime scene to a shared system. That will mean officers can be freed from having to return to base and can spend more time on patrol. There was a collaborative bid from all 4 Welsh forces to create a pan-Wales women's triage system. That received £235,000 from the Innovation Fund. That scheme will help to rehabilitate female offenders and divert them away from a life of crime. And Dyfed Powys was awarded £95,000 from the Innovation Fund to introduce a new computer system that will allow the force to securely share information with the ambulance and fire services during emergency incidents and help response times. And these pioneering projects are exactly the type of schemes we want to see forces doing. They show that innovation and collaboration make the police even better at doing their job and solving crime. And I want to take this opportunity, if I may, to pay tribute to Gwent Police Force for their successful policing of last September's NATO summit, supported by mutual aid officers from across the country. Let us not forget that this was a significant international event which saw one of the largest gatherings of world leaders ever seen in the United Kingdom, and the hard work and dedication of all the officers involved in this substantial operation ensured the safety and security of local residents and delegates. Now,
I thank the Minister for giving way, especially since the earlier start somewhat caught me unawares on this debate. So thank the Minister very much for giving way. And can I agree wholeheartedly with the comments about Gwent Police and the policing of the NATO summit? It was an excellent example, particularly of community policing in action. And I know all the communities I represent greatly appreciate it. So, I thank you for making that.
I think the honourable member speaks for her community very well. In terms of our officer numbers, obviously this is a key issue, and I understand there are concerns about reduction in police numbers in Wales as elsewhere, and this is reflected by the level of the debate which we're having today. We recognise the enormous impact that seeing officers on the street has in providing public reassurance and crime deterrence, and we remain absolutely committed to the principles of visible community policing. But we have also had to be realistic about the tight financial constraints within which we're having to operate public services. This government did inherit the largest peacetime deficit in the country's history, and we have had no alternative but to address that, and I'm sure that would be true whoever came into government at that point. As a service spending £14 billion at the start of the current spending review period, it is inevitable that we have had to look to the police to deliver their share of the savings that we needed. And they have done so. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary recent State of Policing report has reinforced that over the spending review period, forces are successfully balancing their books and protecting frontline services and delivering reductions in crime. And we've always been honest about the fact that with 80% of the police spending being on the workforce itself, reduced budgets will inevitably have an impact on the number of officers and staff that forces are able to employ. The key has been to maximise the savings that can be delivered from the remaining 20% in areas such as procurement and IT, and to prioritise available resources where the public expects to see them at the front line. And we know this is happening in Wales, and I have already mentioned some of the examples of collaboration between Welsh forces that are helping to drive greater efficiency. And I'm pleased to note that not only are a greater proportion of police officers in Wales in frontline roles than was the case in 2010, but these measures have enabled Welsh forces to reinvest savings in increasing their officer numbers over the last 12 months. In terms of Gwent, I recognise that this picture is not wholly reflective in the honourable member's own local force in Gwent, which the published statistics show lost 73 officers in the year to September 2014. The Inspectorate has expressed its concerns over the extent to which the force's change plans rely on workforce reduction, very focused on workforce reduction, without a full understanding of the local service demands and the impact such reductions will have on the skills and rank mix. But it is clear that Gwent has resolved to address this and has resolved to build a sustainable position for the future based on the sort of activities that other forces are successfully implementing. In addition to the promising collaborative work with other Welsh forces and local services that I've already mentioned, the PCC has announced the decision to reopen or extend the opening hours of 9 police stations throughout Gwent, which had previously been closed to the public or had limited opening hours. The force is also developing a new operating model which aims to protect and improve frontline policing by allowing greater flexibility in how it deploys the resources it has available. From April, teams of officers will be based in local police stations rather than operating from response hubs, and each station will be managed locally by a neighbourhood inspector who will have their own team that they can deploy to tackle issues. This local ownership will enhance the service the force provides to communities by increasing police visibility, local knowledge and problem solving in those neighbourhoods. Frontline policing will further be bolstered in numbers by devolving operational support officers to frontline duties. Ultimately, however, decisions on the size and composition of a police force's workforce are for the individual chief officers and police and crime commissioners, taking account of the needs and views of their local communities. And full-time officers are only part of the story. Police staff and PCSOs are an integral part of policing family, as are special constables and other volunteers. And North Wales, for example, which already has more than 120 special constables, is running a recruitment drive to expand this number, particularly in rural areas and amongst Welsh-speaking communities. Of course, a vital part of how policing is delivered today is linked to the technology which officers have at their disposal. Technology has the power to transform and maximise the impact and effectiveness of the resource that forces have at their disposal. Supported in part through the Police Innovation Fund, which I mentioned earlier in my speech, forces are investing in mobile technology to give officers instant, on-the-street access to the systems they need, reducing the need for officers to spend time in the station. In Dyfed Powys, for example, the Police and Crime Commissioner has stated that officers will spend an additional 100,000 hours on the beat this year due to IT improvements implemented by the force, which is a huge amount. In terms of some of the individual points that were raised, fraud has tended to be underreported. We have worked to increase the reporting of it through Action Fraud, that's a specialist reporting and advice service for fraud victims, and the rise in police recorded fraud is likely to reflect the improved reporting in the system which has been introduced over a period of time. In terms of credit cards, the crime survey data on plastic card fraud suggests a small rise in the year to September 2014, but the proportion of card users who suffered fraud was 20% lower than in 2009-2010. In terms of recorded crime being up 3% in Wales, the Office of National Statistics analysis suggests that risks in recorded crime have been driven by improvements in crime recording, particularly for violence. And the Honourable Member opposite raised the issue of some of the incidents of violence against women and going up 30%. And at the Home Office, we welcome that. After the Home Secretary commissioned Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary to do a review of all 43 forces to look at crime recording, it has clearly had a salutary effect, and crime recording is improving as it needed to do. In terms of the importance of back office functions, we recognise the importance of vital support functions, and HMIC has found that not only are forces prioritising available resources in visible policing functions, but also key non-visible frontline roles such as intelligence and safeguarding of vulnerable people. So in closing, I would like to thank honourable members for participating in an informed debate, a well-reasoned debate, and it's clear that police reforms delivered under this government are working. I think the take-home statistic is that under the coalition government, according to the Independent Crime Survey of England and Wales, crime has fallen over 20%, and all of us are safer than we have been for decades, including Wales. And the government recognises that the funding settlement is challenging to PCCs and forces, but it does also bring opportunities, particularly for those prepared to innovate, collaborate and transform, to drive efficiencies and to deliver even better policing across Wales.
Order. Sitting is suspended until 2:30 this afternoon.